Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so very much for joining us for the first panel of today. I've been to many forums in my lifetime, and this has got to be one of the best. It has been fantastic. So I'm really delighted to be welcoming my guest today. Hasn't it been illuminating and energetic? And we've heard so much, and we have one day left to get through all the issues, put solutions on the table, and then importantly discuss those at COP27. My name is Eleni Jakas. I'm an anchor and correspondent for CNN, and really happy to be with you today. I would like to welcome our guests on stage. We have Dr. Rania Al-Mashad, the Minister of International Cooperation for Egypt. She is the big celebrity of this forum. We've been hearing from you every day at almost every panel. We don't know where you get your energy from. We need to find that out. Welcome to Mr. Eric Bergloff, the Chief Economist for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. A warm welcome to Mafalda Duarte, the CEO of Climate Investment Funds. Dr. Khalida Bouzar, the UN Assistant Secretary General, UNDP Assistant Administrator and Director of the UNDP Regional Bureau for Arab States, and James Zahn, the Director of Investment and Enterprise at UNCTAD. Welcome. And Mrs. Oluranti Doherty, the Director of Export Development at Afrixim Bank. We are gearing up for a fantastic conversation where today we'll be focusing on financing. It's ahead of it's a pre-finance day for us and conversation ahead of COP27. We'll be talking about innovative tools, mechanisms, and funding for climate change products and projects on the continent. How to de-risk them? How do we build institutions, the right governance, the right regulation to try and draw in the capital that is so desperately needed? I think we've discussed this so many times over the last couple of days. I'm going to remind you that Africa still only receives around 3% of the climate funds and commitments that have been put on the table. So the questions that have been asked and discussed quite a lot is why the discrepancy, why the gap, and how do we close that? And today we're going to be talking about real projects, how to get them on the go, and importantly, what the funding mechanisms would be, whether it's blended finance, where we're talking about grants and donor funding, concessional loans, and so forth. So welcome to my panelists. A round of applause, please. Let me get some energy in here. All right. Before we begin, we have two messages. Our first message is from Her Majesty Queen Maxima of the Netherlands. This is a very special message, and she wanted to join in the conversation for us. Queen Maxima has served as the United Nations Secretary General's Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance for Development, or the UNSGSA, since 2009. As Special Advocate, she is a leading global voice on advancing universal access to and responsible usage of affordable, effective, and safe financial services. The UNSGSA's work has recently focused on the role of financial services in helping vulnerable segments manage shocks due to climate change, as well as to take advantage of opportunities to participate in the green economy. If we could get that pre-recorded message, please.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to join the Egypt International Cooperation Forum, which offers an important platform to advance sustainable development in Africa, especially now, as we witness the dire consequences of climate change: income loss, food insecurity, increased forced migration, to name a few. Climate change will be the most disruptive force to impact low-income households, women, and small businesses for decades to come. Add to this the knock-on effects of global conflict and soaring inflation, and it is clear that the world needs new solutions to help the most vulnerable build resilience. The financial sector is on the front line of this challenge. It plays a key role in managing environmental and social risks posed by climate change. It also fuels fresh opportunities to transition towards climate-smart economies. In the last decade, 33 countries have launched over 200 national policies to support sustainable finance. Egypt has made important strides in this direction, issuing its guiding principles in 2021. Globally, green bond issuance now top $1.3 trillion. However, this is just a sliver of the story. It is at the micro level of underserved households and small businesses where people face the greatest risks. Over 495 million adults in sub-Saharan Africa still have no access to formal financial services. In many African markets, financial inclusion is lowest where climate risks are the highest. Without quality payments, credit, savings, and insurance products, people have fewer tools to keep their lives on track after weather shocks of natural disasters. Technology is a big part of the solution. It can expand access to finance across hard-to-reach markets that are prone to climate change. It can also bypass traditional geographic and cultural barriers that prevent women from accessing quality financial services. For instance, an impact study found that after rainfall shock in Tanzania, only mobile money users avoided a drop in their consumption. This is because villagers with access to mobile money could quickly receive additional remittances for support, helping to replace two-thirds of the losses that they incurred from the shock. Equally, financial inclusion fuels opportunities to participate in the green economy. Sun Culture, an irrigation equipment supplier in Kenya, using an innovative model, allows farmers to increase their revenue despite harsh climatic conditions, while mitigating over 20,000 tons of CO2 annually. As we look towards COP27, I would like to suggest a call to action. A collective effort that is gender inclusive is needed to make African economies resilient to climate change, providing solutions that safeguard its vast natural resources and empower its young population. Financial inclusion can be a big part of this journey. However, to get there, we need vision and common priorities. For policymakers, this includes placing financial inclusion at the core of sustainability frameworks, ensuring households and small businesses have the financial tools to combat climate change. For governments, we need investments in digital public goods. They include digital identification systems, connectivity, and interoperable payment systems. These form the rails that underpin financial inclusion, but can also be designed for use beyond finance, including health, education, and climate. For Africa's private sector, including renewable energy companies, financial institutions, fintechs, and agtech firms, this means scaling up market solutions for climate-smart agriculture, green buildings, and off-grid electricity. These sectors are key to mitigating emissions and an important source of employment for young people. I encourage all stakeholders to do more rigorous research into how households and small businesses can effectively adapt to climate change patterns and seize climate-smart investment opportunities. This research will help develop more programs that have impact and can scale. Let us recognize that sustainable finance is not possible without inclusive finance. Leadership and commitment will help us achieve both objectives, taking us to a greener, more sustainable, and more resilient future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Queen Maxima, for that inspiring message. And Her Majesty has certainly made today a substantive contribution. She's hit all the important challenges, but also offered solutions of what needs to be done next. I'd like to now introduce our next pre-recorded message, a message from Mr. Matthias Cormann, the Secretary General of the OECD. Mr. Matthias Cormann has been serving as the Secretary General of the OECD since 2021. And among his priorities is leadership on climate action to help secure global net zero by 2050. Let's take a listen.
Ministers, distinguished guests, extreme weather events caused by climate change pose a serious threat globally everywhere. But they present a particular risk for the development prospects of the African continent. Africa's legitimate growth aspirations and the need to create jobs for a growing young population mean we need to meet both our climate and development objectives. Africa has the potential to play a leading role as the world transitions towards net zero. 12 countries in Africa, representing over 40% of total emissions from the continent, have made net zero pledges. Towards this, Africa has enormous renewable energy potential, with an opportunity to drive clean development across the continent, enhancing energy security and economic competitiveness, and indeed setting Africa on a path to be a leader in clean energy technologies. To facilitate this, we need to rapidly scale up finance for the green transition. Our latest analysis shows that in 2020, climate finance from developed to developing countries reached $83.3 billion US, still short of the $100 billion goal. And between 2016 and 2020, African countries received an average of 26% of climate finance flows. So one question is, how best to support Africa in developing its own solutions to unlock the continent's potential contribution to the energy transition, as well as its capacity to adapt to climate shocks. COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November will be a critical moment for advancing financing of climate mitigation and adaptation. The OECD stands ready to play its part. We will continue to advocate for greater ambition and implementation, provide transparency on climate finance, and promote the policy reforms needed to align finance flows with net zero and climate resilient development. For example, we are working with the Egyptian presidency and other partners on the Sharm el-Sheikh guidebook on financing a just transition to identify opportunities to catalyze the needed finance for the net zero transition. Our forthcoming guidance on transition finance will also provide key elements of credible corporate climate transition plans in line with the Paris Agreement. We're also working to ensure public funds help leverage higher levels of private capital. Our blended finance guidance for clean energy will support policymakers, donors, and the private sector to more effectively design and deploy public finance interventions to crowd in private investment. This will contribute towards meeting the estimated $4 trillion US globally needed every year for clean energy investments by 2030. For Africa, achieving energy and climate objectives means more than doubling energy investments this decade, up to $190 billion US each year from 2026 to 2030. Finally, at COP27, we are launching a report on the increasing risks of triggering climate tipping points and the important implications for designing climate adaptation strategies. In order to help move forward on these and other challenges, the OECD and the African Union Commission are jointly defining an ambitious partnership to tackle shared priorities and to address global challenges on an equal footing. Financing for development in general and financing for a just climate transition in particular are likely to feature high in this partnership. By working together on ways of mobilizing such needed resources, both public and private, we can help Africa meet its energy access challenges while also playing a key role. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much to the OECD Secretary General, Matthias Cormann there. I'm going to take a couple of things that he said and weave them into our conversation. He said that Africa has legitimate growth aspirations. He also said we've got to be very wary of reaching climate tipping points, which, of course, we know is one of the biggest risks. All this while we're having the discussion on how to make projects bankable, how to ensure that we get money flowing into the continent. We've already ascertained that it's absolutely not enough. The money's not coming to the continent. And Dr. Rania, I want to bring you in here. And with all the conversations that you've been having, I think this has been one of the big sticking points. We're running out of time. We could reach a climate tipping point. We want to industrialize the continent. And we need to marry that with SDGs and with sustainable financing. So what are the things that you've got top of mind to find solutions to these dilemmas?
Well, thank you very much, Eleni. And let me say that when we were designing the agenda for the ICF this year, and it has the ministers of finance, environment, and economy, we wanted this to be a launch pad for Finance Day. Finance Day is one of the important days during COP. There you have the demand and also those who supply in order to be able to push the climate action agenda. This COP, as has been repeated, is a COP where voices from the South need to be heard. What is it that the African continent in particular needs? And we've heard a lot over the past 2 days, adaptation, resilience, loss and damage. How can we bring the private sector in adaptation projects, which might have the perception that they are not very much bankable or have a profit stream? Also, we've heard a very important objective going from pledges to implementation. That can only be translated into investable projects. So at the ICF, we've had all our colleagues from the financial institutions, from the climate funds, everybody hearing from our African colleagues, ministers of finance, environment, economy, in order to achieve exactly what you were, framed in your question, that climate and development come hand in hand. We need to keep on pushing this message that climate should not be necessarily a burden on countries if we are able to avail the proper financing and create the bankable projects. Maybe 2 things to mention, and it was mentioned or 3 things mentioned in the speeches the recorded messages. Yesterday we had the roundtable on Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing. This is an effort that we coordinated with many institutions, financial institutions and think tanks and philanthropy and private sector. And the concept was to see what each stakeholder needs to do in order to move from pledges to implementation. This is going to be one of the products presented during Finance Day at COP, and that day is November 9th. The other thing which is important is we wanted to show an example as Egypt on how we took a climate strategy that actually integrates climate and development in a nexus of water, food, and energy. So we have adaptation and we have mitigation. These are projects which are bankable. And on the first day, we had the roundtable where the international community, with the private sector, with the financial institutions, shown support to be able to see how we can actually use this Egypt country platform for the NWEFI program in order to show that investable projects can be implemented, and hence we go from pledges to implementation. Gender was mentioned, SMEs were mentioned. There is an initiative with the COP presidency on gender and climate that is also going to be unveiled during COP. And in the discussions that you attended with us yesterday, investments in SMEs that provide solutions and technology come hand in hand. So all of these topics, and I have to say that there's so much discussion on climate for many, many years. I think this time we have convergence a little bit more on what is of urgent need to move forward on. So these are just some thoughts on the preparation, and today being a launch pad for Finance Day. All the discussions over these hopefully 3 days come out with a communique. My colleague, Minister of Finance, Dr. Mait, is working with ministers of finance and ministers of environment to come up with a communique, the ask of Africa, to be presented during Finance Day at COP.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rania. I would like to bring in Dr. Khalida. We are sitting in a climate finance desert right now, which of course is ironic because the continent is absolutely vulnerable and faces enormous risks. It is a hotspot. What do you think is going to be a catalyst to transitioning on the continent? And we're talking about finance here. So, what would then be those mechanisms to alleviate the climate finance drought that we're experiencing and converge that with the realities of it being a hotspot?
Thank you very much. Let me first thank Dr. Rania for this opportunity. This event has also been a very good opportunity to network and to meet ministers and to listen to them. On what you said, I just want to maybe to come back to what we have been hearing here in the ICF. Obviously, it's a top priority. Climate change is a top priority. We hear that and we know that and we agree on that. But also scaling up climate finance continues to be a challenge. You mentioned earlier the percentage of global investment coming to Africa is 2%. Is it acceptable? The answer is no. So on that, we need to also look at the transformation that we agreed on and everybody bought in Paris. So we should not go backward. So this is very important. In UNDP, we have a climate promise, and we are supporting the NDCs, as we call them in our jargon, the National Determined Contribution, and we supported 96% of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I want to say that we have these tools as investment plan. Now the question how to transform this investment plan in investment. And to do that, it was mentioned bankable project. The question that I want to pose, we talk about money, it is very important. I had several meetings with ministers that were telling me we need money, but we need capacity. And this is not easy to get. So I think we need to think about the soft part of the investment. And here it takes me to another comment on the need to have the right enabling environment. We know that the government alone cannot make a big difference. Resources are becoming scarcer and scarcer, so the private sector is key. But for the private sector to invest and for the financial flows from the private sector to be unlocked, they need the right enabling environment. So we're talking about the institution, the laws, and for example, in Gabon, we are supporting, Gabon is a brown industry. We are supporting them to become green. They are providing and putting a package for incentives for the private sector to invest. This is very important, but going hand in hand also strengthening capacities of the government, the institutions, without forgetting the local level, as the Queen Massima was just saying.
Thank you very much. There's so much to focus on with so much of what you said. I'm going to try and unravel that as the conversation continues. But I want to bring in Oluranti because, the notion of perceptions of risk towards Africa, by the way, is a very sort of old adage that we keep referring to. And then I keep asking, is it perceptions? Is it reality? We've just heard from Dr. Buzar that we have to have an enabling environment. By the time we fix institutions to the level where, money feels safe to flow, I'm worried that the cost of risks are going to increase dramatically, and then we're going to have a bigger crisis on our hands. But from your perspective at African Bank, what are you doing to create the bankable projects, right? And we have to remember the most industrialized countries on the continent are 4, and they contribute, I think, 40 or 60% to the total greenhouse gas emissions on the continent. So why aren't we seeing big money flowing into those countries that have already very strong institutions? So I have tons of questions, but it boils down to perceptions of risk towards Africa, whether it's mispriced and whether we're just delaying a very big risk that is on our doorstep.
Thank you, Eleni, for the question. And just before I start with my responses, I want to thank the Honorable Minister for the invite to the ICF and the partnership with African Bank and hosting this event. Just to speak to your question, Eleni, you and I had a brief discussion earlier, and one of the things we talked about was why is it that every time it comes to Africa, what you keep hearing is we don't have the bankable projects, the risk sky high, we can't attract financing, we can't. Is this really the reality? I would say it's more of perception. Every time it comes to African projects, African initiatives, you have this perception of the risk being high. But if you look at it, the flip side is this. Africa is just the casualty of successful industrialization by the West. Now we are at a crossroad where Africa is suffering from a lot of the impacts of industrialization, the climate challenge, the adaptation issues, the flood, the droughts, which are taking a lot of money from sovereign countries on the continent to address this issue. But on the other side, how do we ensure that the countries that have predominantly played a key role in these greenhouse gas emissions support Africa in, fulfilling and addressing mitigation issues, adaptation issues, and resilient issues? This, I think, is the key issue we face. At Afrexim Bank, we have decided to take a different perspective to this. We know for certain that if we are going to turn our story around on the continent, it has to start with ourselves. And that is why I'm appreciative of some of the initiatives that Minister Rania and the Egyptian government have put in place. And we are keen and will be willing to support this. But we also decided to tackle the issue on bankable projects within the bank. And we created a project preparation facility unit. That project preparation unit, what it does is it has a special focus on renewable projects and sustainable projects. And it works to aggregate these projects together, to work on this project from concept stage to bankability, and to enable this project attract end financial capital from equity investors, debt financiers, and venture capitals. To date, we've had over 2 billion of these renewable and energy efficient projects developed by the bank and put there. So the bank's focus is this. We have to
Have you seen international money flowing in?
So what we've been able to do is, for the projects we've been able to develop, we've been able to attract financing within the continent and outside of the continent in support of this. But we had to start first. We had to make this, take the first step in investing to de-risk some of these projects.
Thank you very much. Mafalda, I'd like to come to you. I want to talk about the innovative mechanisms, the products that can be used to, look at climate financing on the continent. Based on what Olorante said as well, I wonder if I want you to talk about the perceptions of risk, and then how certain tools and mechanisms, financing tools and mechanisms, can help overcome some of the challenges that you're experiencing on the ground.
Thank you very much. And again, Minister, thank you very much for having us and hosting this wonderful forum. And thank you for giving voices to the women in the panel first. I've realized that you're picking up on a really good point. Secretary Kerry, the last 2 days, I heard him speak twice. He does something that is really important, is framing. Let's look at the context here. And this is a really important discussion. As the minister said, this is the launchpad to Finance Day at COP. So framing a little bit, and I'm coming to the perceptions of risk. We know we have to invest significantly more on climate relevant investments, but we also know of this finance divide. And one of the very interesting analyses that has come out recently is the UN Financing Sustainable Development Report, where they really put numbers on the table, which I think are really important to bear in mind. Developed countries use 3.5% of their revenue to service interest rate on their debt. Developing countries use, least developed countries, 14%. Developed countries, on their outstanding debt, they pay 1% of interest costs. Developing countries pay 3%. In Africa, a lot of the countries pay 8%. What we have, so this is a finance divide. what COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine has now done, it has aggravated this. We now have issues, serious issues of debt. We have the doubling of the number of countries since 2015 at high risk or already at debt distress. And interestingly, as well, Brookings has also put out some analysis on this not long ago, making this point that despite the fact that Africa, the economic impact in Africa, whereas global average contraction was 3.3%, in Africa was 2%. But in any case, most of the downgrades were in Africa. And so this is why, an institution like Brookings has also come out and say, Africa is paying perception premiums.
And it always has, actually.
It's paying perception premiums even with improved macroeconomic fundamentals or growth prospects. It is paying perception premiums. So this is a very important, and it's going to make your task and Egypt task of hosting COP more challenging, because clearly this is the conversation. How does one deal with this at a time where we really have to accelerate climate action? And there's a number of measures. When we talk about the finance ecosystem as well, there are different degrees of things that need to happen. We need, and some of the measures are there. We need credit rating agencies to embark on long-term sovereign ratings that actually take into account climate considerations. We need to develop domestic debt markets. It's another interesting data point. Since January 2021, issuances of debt in the lower rated markets decreased from 30 billion to 7.5 billion. So we clearly need to look at this at these various levels, and see what do we need to do at this broader financial ecosystem level, and what do we need to do. I can come back to.
Yeah, we've got so many questions, and I've written so many notes because I have tons of follow-ups for you. And I'm glad you said that we're paying a perception premium. This has probably been one of the top questions I've been asking to world leaders and multinational companies since I started my career a very long time ago. James, I want to bring you in here. And UNCTAD has been doing a lot of work on the ground. What would you say is the solution to some of the perception of risk issues that we face? And how are you overcoming these? Because you want to do work in Africa, you're on the ground, you're embarking on projects, so you see firsthand how reality and perception are actually, don't actually often go hand in hand.
Thank you. First of all, I wish to congratulate Minister of International Cooperation for compiling the guidebook for climate financing, just transformation. And UNCTAD is very proud to associate with that, providing the inputs, and we are committed to help for dissemination once you launch it. Thank you for that. And that's one of the very concrete deliverables for what you ask for. I wish to share with you the 3 observations and then 3 concrete policy measures to leverage private sector investment for climate change and just transformation. First, the overall trends. We have observed that the sustainability financing has been increasing significantly, but very little goes to the most needed. When we look at the numbers, in fact, the sustainability themed finance over the past 2 years boomed significantly. Last year, it increased by 63%, reached $5.2 trillion. And that consists of $2.7 trillion of private equity funds, and 1.5 trillion US dollars of green bonds, and 400 billion of US dollars of social bonds. And the rest is mixed. So that's the rough idea. And that was the 62% of increase last year was on top of over 80% of increase in 2019. So that shows the magnitude of the increase rapidly. But having said that, there are three triple challenges I would see. First, scaling up still. We need to bring this sustainability financing from the niche of the market to the mainstream. If you look at the share of sustainability themed finance, for equity funds, it counts only 4% of the open-end equity funds in the global market. For green bonds, it counts only less than 2% of the global bonds. So that shows, on the one hand, the potential for further growth. On the other hand, to show that's still not enough, we need to scale up. So that is the scale up issue. The second is regional disparity. If we look at the distribution of all these funds, 82% domiciled and used in Europe, and the rest, large part of the rest goes to the US, China. So that is the poorest countries haven't got that. The third thing is its sectors. If you look at that, the overwhelming proportion of the sustainability funds goes to renewables. So it's more of mitigation. And for adaptation, it's hardly any to the poorest. So these are the triple challenges. What can we do? I would say concretely, obviously there are three. How to get, the key is to get the investment on the ground in the climate sectors. The first is really to have the double embedding investment promotion strategies in the climate change strategies, industrial development strategies of developing countries, and also embed climate change investment, climate change strategies and targets into the country's investment promotion strategies. For the time being, they are disconnected for many countries. They need
Do you think that's what
approach.
Europe and the US
That's
did
the
better?
first one.
They did that better than Africa, that they involved, climate change strategies within
That's right.
the
We need a
investment
double
strategy.
embedding. That's what we have done through the survey in our World Investment Report. The second thing is that we need international consortium to help developing countries, particularly African countries, to develop bankable pipeline projects. We need to convert all these investment promotion agencies in the countries into sustainable development pipeline project development agencies, paired with multinationals, paired with, supported by multilateral development banks and international organizations like us, and also the practitioners in investment field. So there's kind of four types of people working together to help countries develop pipeline project. The third thing that can be done is that special economic zones. There are 7,000 special economic zones in over 140 countries. The majority of them are in developing countries. These zones provide a kind of better mini ecosystems for attracting private sector investment. We need to help with these zones to convert it into the zones for sustainable development, including attract investment in climate change sectors.
James, thank you very much. Dr. Bergloff, you have the benefit of having heard everyone's comments, so I'm not even going to ask you a question. What has stood out for you as we embark on the Pre-Finance Day?
Well, thank you. And I was going to talk about a couple of very specific initiatives, but I was very inspired, particularly by the initial intervention by Her Majesty the Queen Maxima, but also by Dr. Ranya's intervention. And I will say something about that first. So I come from an institution that is very committed to climate finance. That's our number one objective, is to reach 50% climate finance by 2025. And we're already at 48%. We have about 25% of that is adaptation finance. But I think what that initial address brings out, and I would I think is also under the surface of many of the other remarks, is that, you know, at the core of the financial system is trust. And, you know, what we are living right now is a very fundamental distrust in the global system. And it was always there, but it has been amplified by, you know, the vaccine debacle. It has been amplified by the consequences of the war on Ukraine, the food prices, the fuel prices. You know, in that environment, to talk about, you know, how to deliver finance, how to address climate issues, how to build together the net zero transition is very difficult. So we need to try to think about how can we build this net zero transition together and not try to impose it from whether it's from the leadership of multilateral development banks or from institutions based in the advanced economy. So this really is what I think comes out of that message from Her Majesty. We need to connect the issue of financial access, inclusion, and financing. And you know, these inequalities that we are seeing, they don't come alone. So you have you know, access to finance, you have access to health, access to education, impact of climate. They all come together. You have, you know, when you talk about inequality, it's really about inequality of opportunities. And finance is about creating opportunities and allowing people to develop, not leaving people outside the labor force, and not leaving countries outside participation in international trade. And I think that we just have to have that in mind when we think about how we create development and how we give access to finance. But I think I just want to make that remark. So we have spoken a lot about opportunities for finance. I think we should also talk about technologies and innovation, because I think ultimately the net zero transition is about making sure that all these new technologies that are either not scalable right now or are not even in the markets, that needs to be implemented across the world, that those are made accessible to countries in the emerging developing world. And that, I think, is very much the role that my institution, and I know other development banks, take very seriously as well. And we have created platforms for that, and where we are trying to get involved very early on in investments in climate-friendly technologies, green technologies. We believe very much that when you can, the kind of things that help you develop in terms of economic growth are also the kind of things that help you develop in terms of innovating and adopting new technologies. And by having genuine participation in developing these new forms of finance, you also can bring along countries in that process. Let me end with one initiative that was launched yesterday that I think also is in the spirit of innovation and allowing countries to come in to participation in the net zero transition. It's a project it's about looking at the world today, particularly after the war in Ukraine, with the debt situation, with the climate pressures. It's an initiative about connecting the nature-based solutions and debt, and looking at how can we issue debt that allows countries to, or gives countries incentives to implement climate solutions or improving their nature, and it's called F4B. It's an opportunity, we call it performance-linked bonds. The hub that was announced yesterday will collect experience around the world, try to standardize contracts, make it possible for emerging and developing countries to bring down their fiscal or create fiscal space for other things is, I think, one way of creating
That's a
more
really
participation.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned bonds because we've just spoken about Africa paying a perception premium. So I'm wondering how those bonds are going to be priced. That's the issue. So Dr. Rania, I want to come back to you. We've heard from everyone, and we kind of have some things on the table that we can juggle in terms of discussion points. The perception of risk premium, which has been around for a very long time, is absolutely of concern. And if I look at the value chain of Africa being involved at the negotiating table at any COP, firstly, we didn't have a loud enough voice. Now we've got a bit of a voice and people are listening. Now we're not seeing the money flowing through. Not really, because we're seeing projects are not actually happening to the extent that they're bankable, perception of risk, credit ratings. We heard from yesterday about the sovereign rating agencies and how they're complicating the perception of risk as well. I mean, we're talking about mispricing. So when you go to the negotiating table at COP27, what is going to be the main message, would you say, to get money flowing into Africa? Or do you think that we're, as Africans, going to accept we don't have enough bankable projects and the ball is in our court and we have to make that happen first, despite the moral obligation of the biggest emitters in the world?
Well, I think that every institution who is represented here has a role to play.
Yeah.
And so if we're looking at UNCTAD and the UN system and UNDP, each one has been helping nations on the NDCs. UNDP has been doing a fantastic job in trying to provide that technical support. And why are NDCs important? Because they lower that perception, right? They are saying that countries are serious about the climate agenda. And what we want to see is that climate and development are one. So you're creating the jobs, you're actually inclusive, and you're trying to think forward, looking forward. So I think each and every, the African Exim Bank and other multilateral development banks, in addition to the financing, there's the technical assistance that is required to make the project sustainable. So I believe that when we say negotiations, if every institution, as has been laid out and as the work plan so far has been going forward, if everyone does their job in that way, I think we are going to be able to move forward and bring down that perception risk. Of course, in the world of finance, and we have Citibank here and others, there's a system that exists. To shake that system or to change it is going to take a very, very long time. And that's the way the world is designed. What we want to do is, given that design, how can we create cracks to be able to move ahead in a way that is useful and sensible? And I think that was also the crux of our discussion yesterday. There was a lot of, talk about reforming the Bretton Woods institutions, et cetera, fine. How long will that take? Where's who's going to be doing it until we find an equilibrium?
So we have to work with what we have right now.
We have to work with what we have, and we have to work fast. And there are lessons learned from shortcomings, and there are successful examples. Why don't we try to replicate? So time is very short, and I think that's the message that Secretary Kerry was mentioning in his opening remarks, and all of us agree to that. So let's try and move forward with what we have, but make sure that what we have is complementary, what we have is serious, what we have has political commitment and political will. I think that's the approach that might get us somewhere, and continue to try and fix the system, that too. But there needs to be parallel tracks. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in trying to amend something very big, and then we lose opportunities. I think that's the message that's how Egypt has been working since 2011 in trying to find the opportunities and push ahead with certain things, and have climate within our development projects, and have an integrated strategy for energy, and try, so things move. We want to have a bigger system, yes, but let's see how we can leverage on what we have. We have very strong partnerships. The commitment of people being here during these 3 days and having serious discussions and confronting one another, having the African ministers here with us, voicing their concerns. And there were so many meetings where, they trying to find these practical ways to move forward. So if we cannot fix everything, but let's use what we have and try and push ahead. That's my 2 cents on the topic.
Oluwanti, I want to get you in here because this is what we had spoken about offline. And you were saying, one thing that struck me is that we're trying to fix the problem with a very system that created the problem. And it really struck me because we spoke about moral responsibility and, is the West or the biggest emitters hiding behind the guise of we don't have enough bankable projects or else we'd be in Africa, no problem, which, this comes to the issue with multinationals want to come into the continent, that Africa needs to retrofit into a system that clearly does not exist, at scale on the continent yet. And then we miss out on alleviating the impact of this climate emergency.
Thank you, Eleni. Yes, we've been talking for so many years about attracting blended finance, concessional finance, pledges made, not being fulfilled. And, we seem to be going round and round in circle. There's been so many things, we've been trying to do on the continent to attract finance, and we've not been able to do that. Even going beyond just attracting finance for development of projects, attracting finance for human capital development, attracting finance for technical know-how, attracting finance for intellectual property transfer needed to even scale up on adaptation measures, mitigation measures are not there. And that's why, when I was speaking to you earlier, I kind of leaning towards what Minister Renia has said. We have to do this ourselves, meaning Africa itself, Africa regional development institutions, African governments. We have to come around together and provide some homegrown solutions that we can offer to the West or to the development partners. Because if we are waiting for them to come and solve our problem and provide the solution and give us
we just said we don't have enough fiscal space, right? We don't have the fiscal space at this point in time. So how are we going to create that fiscal space to solve our own problems?
So one of the things we've tried to do as a development institution is to come up with development of innovative financial products that could help develop or broaden that fiscal space. One of this is one of the products I mentioned to you earlier, which is the liquidity sustainability facility. We all talked about the fact that African bonds or African traded bonds are not liquid. African countries are not able to attract financing through issuance of their sovereign bonds. Or when they do this, it's at a very high premium, the risks, the perception premium we just spoke about. So what we did in Afreximbank is to partner with UNICA on the Liquidity Sustainability Fund, which seeks to ensure that African bonds and African traded SDG or climate-related bonds can be liquid at international market. What we are providing here is a facility that supports or provides some comfort to bond investors that want to trade in African bonds. So we are trying to use innovative products to address fiscal issues.
Mafalda, let's talk about the negotiating table at COP27. And given that heading up the climate investment funds, what are the conversations that need to happen for the people around the negotiating table to understand that Africa is paying this perception premium, as you say, that Africa in large part has always been collateral damage regardless of what happens globally, and that there is a moral responsibility to think about things differently, to expedite financing?
I think I don't know if I would say gladly or I don't have the hard task of being at the negotiation table. Those that are, I really vouch for them. It's a difficult task. But I think we need to continue to bring this data, and it's really good that institutions like the UN and others are putting this data out. I think, because I'm not sure that there's sufficient awareness of the data that we were talking about earlier on. And the fact that, and I agree with Minister Rani, I think we need efforts to reform the system, but we can't wait for the system to
It's going to happen
reform.
in tandem, right?
It needs to happen in tandem.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need to move forward. Climate action needs to happen. We can't wait for the broader system to be fixed. And we need to understand that public capital has been used in the past to de-risk investments. And I was giving the examples the other day in the other panel that I was with you. We ourselves, we manage public capital from developed countries to support climate investments in low and middle income countries. And we have proven, even on the back of a financial crisis in 2008, and where there were barely climate investments happening in these markets, many countries in Africa included, with that public capital playing a specific role, we attracted investments. Not only governments.
What percentage would public capital need to have within those investments to then attract foreign investment?
Our average is 10% of our risk concessional capital.
Okay.
What
kind of returns do these investments have and offer?
That's a different conversation, because we have a sovereign portfolio, so it's not really about returns.
Yeah.
It's about impact, and governments wanting to see impact and trying to borrow as affordably as possible.
Yeah.
Now, on the private sector side, is de-risking, so that the private sector doesn't ask for prohibitively higher premiums or returns. So I'll frame that differently. But my point is that public capital and this public capital needs to be used in different ways. I mean, we have several examples, and the Queen, Her Majesty, was talking about the SMEs and inclusive finance. I think in Africa we need to see a lot more of the commercial institutions, local commercial institutions, to lend to the real economy, to the SMEs, for climate resilience purposes. We have supported this type of transactions in other regions of the world. We have seen very limited uptake of that in the African context. But with this public capital, what one does, for example, in those circumstances, is we provide advisory services to the commercial institutions so that they structure these credit lines, and they promote the product, and then we subsidize the first lines of credit, so that you are also attracting, creating that demand. The lower income households, they take on these credit lines, and they are investing in resilience and mitigation objectives and results. So this is at the lowest level, and a lot of adaptation is localized.
Yeah.
It needs solutions, local solutions, but you need different use of the public capital. If we're talking about large infrastructure investments,
yeah,
public capital plays a different role there.
Thank you for that. I want to bring in Dr. Khalida. UNDP is in 200 countries, right? I want to talk about what role partnerships will play for you to solve this issue, and whether that is perhaps one of the big solutions that could be put on the table on Finance Day.
Thank you very much. I just want to also to emphasize that we are living in a world of crisis. So the challenge of the African countries is also to deal with the day-to-day crisis with a long-term future. So I wanted to say that. On partnership, we mentioned the private partnership and the need for investment, but we believe that we need a public-private partnership together with international institutions, be it financing institutions, UN institutions, and even private civil society, sorry. So I think this is very important. We need to have also de-risking, as one was mentioning, but there are some low-hanging fruits that we can take immediately. We heard debt swap, we heard green bond. These do not need investment, big investments. We need to do that. But again, sorry to come back to my question, my issue before, we need capacity. We are working with the city, and I am glad to see that the representative is here. We are working in Cameroon, Senegal, Gabon, and Rwanda to build domestic capacity for thematic debt instruments. So this is very important. The other thing that I didn't hear much about is adaptation. We have the tendency to look at investment in terms of private sector for green energy, solar panel, green hydrogen, etc. But adaptation is critical. If you see what happened in Pakistan, also we have not spoken about the floods in Sudan. The farmers are suffering. Every critical event is impacting their harvest, their livelihood, etc. So, for example, in Sudan, we have established a climate risk insurance that when these events are happening, we help them to have access to social support. Before you take the floor from me, I have other points to make. I think Minister Rania made a very important point, the issue of demand and supply. The demand needs to be well articulated. And this is where I think there is a weakness for us as African. Then we heard about investment and bankable project, but to have bankable projects, you have to have banks who lend you money. And if they lend you money, it's not because it's for profit at the end of the day, right? So I think one easy thing to do is to call on the financing institution to offer softer loans. Because the last thing we would like to do as African is to burden further. The debt is very high. You look at Sudan, it's 252 of the GDP. So I think we need to push also, if I may call on Dr. Rania, to push the financial institution during COP to have different lending terms for this adaptation, climate change. I think this will be very important. I think that's it. I would like to come back to what Queen Massima said, the financial inclusion. Just one last comment. I think we need to look at the national level, the international level, but let's not forget the local level. This is the people who are the most affected. Thank you very much.
Dr. Khalida, absolutely. It is the people that are most affected. And this is why this conversation over the past couple of days, Dr. Rania, has been so illuminating, because it's like from pledges to implementation and everything we've been hearing. This is still a big value chain that we need to address, right? And this is why we need to be ready for those negotiations during COP27. James, you know, I don't want to sound cynical or worried, but I have to say that I am definitely leaning on the side of worried, only because so many of my African friends, my African CEOs that I speak to, the people leading institutions, they're still sitting in disbelief that this money will be deployed. If we look at the money that has been, so 3%, right, around there, what are those projects that are successful that we could perhaps replicate and then scale up across the continent? Is that something that you look at? Because you were talking about the trends, you're talking about investment strategies. We need to make bigger noise, and that could perhaps be one of the ways to bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. We need to differentiate. When we talk about the financing and investing, we may mix up the two concepts. In fact, there's a debt-based financing and there's equity-based investing. These are interrelated, but they are different. When we talk about investing, we talk about investment chain. The upstream is financing. You need to mobilize resources, and then that can be bonds, equities, and all these. And then you have the downstream, which is really direct investment, equity, and that the investment risk is on the private sector, not on less on the government. So that the private equity-based investment is lacking in the area of climate transformation. That's what we need to encourage more. And for that, there's a great potential. But the key issue is that when I talk about the bankable pipeline project, it's related to equity-based investment, not really all these bonds, the debt-based financing. And for that, there's a great potential. We really need to look at specifically the project, whether Egypt has identified 3 excellent areas: water, food, energy. And you're really focusing on that, find the mega projects. I think the minister talked about that the day before yesterday, the grand plan. And really get, as I said, in the way of doing that in the 3 areas I mentioned earlier. I can elaborate. The double embedding in terms of investment investment strategies. And really, the consortium, you need private sector involved in developing the bankable equity investment projects on the ground. And you really need to transform investment promotion agencies to development, project development agencies. It's not that yet. And also regulatory, there are still barriers we need to take into account. International investment treaties, for example, there are 3,400 bilateral sub-regional, regional investment treaties. They have investor state dispute settlement mechanisms. And 2,800 are in force, and most of them were signed before the climate compact, before the sustainable development imperative in the last decade. I'm talking about in the 90s, 80s, and the beginning of the century. They need to be changed. Otherwise, when governments put in place the climate change related transformation measures, that may have a problem trigger the kind of investor state dispute. We have just published a kind of stock taking and review of these issues. You can read that. And also we need to bear in mind global corporate income tax reforms. It is important, it's necessary, is as part of the SDG goals, and countries need to mobilize domestic resources for sustainable development. In the meantime, we need to reorient it and reformulate investment incentive schemes in countries, because they'll be impacted on that, better focused, and then not to really have the conflict between the two. It's a balancing. There are many issues we need to deal with.
Yeah, and lots of instruments and mechanisms to explore. I want to shift the conversation a bit, Dr. Rania. I want to ask you something that has sort of been whispered around, and we heard this, that we need a vibrant carbon market as well. And I mentioned this example earlier in the week, and I mentioned the DRC wanting to exploit its national resources because it wants to develop. And the AFDB, I had a conversation with them, and they said, Africa's current greenhouse gas emissions are correlated to poverty cycle. Greenhouse gas emissions historically have been correlated to economic growth. If Africa were really to start embarking on processing plants and industrialization, instead of just exporting more materials, we'd be sitting with a very different crisis and scenario on our hands as well. And then it comes up, carbon credits. How do you bring that into the negotiating table? Should be part of Finance Day.
Yeah, so the COP presidency is looking into an initiative on that. And I think for countries in Africa, Egypt included, we have not explored it. And actually in conversations with many of our international partners, we're trying to see how we can actually design within our framework, maybe in NOAFI, because there are very specific projects. There's an energy project and also agriculture projects. So how can we use this as a beginning for us to explore that market in a big way? So I think just going back to Khalida's point about the technical capacity in different countries for the design of that, for capturing it, for making sure that the perception risk is less, because there's that commitment and that clear vision of trying to move forward. So you're absolutely right. It is a topic that is to be explored, and hopefully today in the communique from our African ministers, that is going to be also voiced and included. And we will be reading that out at the closing session.
Fantastic. We've got about 20 minutes left. I just want to gauge from the audience, does anyone have anything to contribute or ask a question? Right at the back there. Can we get a microphone? Okay. Well, Jay, over to you. Whether you like it or not. Speak to me.
Thank you. I'd just like to say a couple things. One, I just want to reinforce what Minister Rania said earlier about the importance of dual track, parallel tracks of the big picture ambition of COP, of how will the developed world come to COP to address the challenges of Africa, be they food, energy, debt, in the context of mitigation and adaptation and climate change. What will the new tools be? What will we do to move the Bretton Woods organizations, to have the development banks take more risk,
Those are massive problems, and looking at whether country platforms and JETP will be adapted to the problems of Africa, as President Macron has said. So that has to be addressed. But at the same time, unless we take a NWEFI type approach, which fundamentally designs ambition against projects and says, here are my projects. Now, developed community, now GFANs, come help us fund them. Then, we could spend a long time continuing to fight the big fight and miss the opportunities available to create fundable projects.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And Eric, I want you to jump in here because you've been, as a development institution in Asia, you've been dealing with some of these very big topics, right? So it's bankable projects that are going to help invest and create funding in that space. How do you overcome some of the issues we've spoken about?
Well, first of all, we are actually also present in Africa and in Egypt very much, and we are very proud to be involved in several projects here on renewables and in greening the infrastructure in Egypt as well. And I very much support what was said here, and I think it goes to what Dr. Rania was talking about. You have to go ahead and cannot wait for the system to be reformed. The country platform that has been launched here in Egypt, I think is about what you were talking about. It's about putting concrete projects on a platform, making sure that everything is coordinated, all the players, domestic players. Of course, it has to be owned, and I think the ownership that the Egyptian government, Dr. Rania and others involved have shown that that's how you have to do it. And I think that's what I was talking about before. If you don't have that ownership, you're not going to succeed. And you have to prioritize across projects. You have to integrate development and climate, and that is the key.
And Eric, given the fact that you do have projects on the continent, specifically within the renewable space, what do you make of this conversation that we need more bankable projects? It's very risky. It's a big risk. Have you experienced that, having done the work on the ground? And how would you suggest to de-risk some of these projects?
No, I think a lot of the elements have been already mentioned. And I wanted to pick up one idea, which I think it's a very simple idea and one that I've seen working wonderfully. And it's a very simple idea. You mentioned it. It's credit lines through commercial banks for energy efficiency, for climate-related things. I saw it. I had a previous life at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and we did it first in Bulgaria. And it's very simple. You gave a little bit of subsidy to train the bankers, and you give a little bit incentive for various entrepreneurs, SMEs to come forward. And you do that once, and then the banks know how to do this. You may want to give a little bit of additional incentives to entrepreneurs to come forward, but you don't have to give it a second time. The second credit line, you don't have to do it. And then, that's mushroom throughout Bulgaria and then throughout Eastern Europe. When we came to Estonia, we didn't need to do it because all the banks had done it. This is a very simple way of getting this kind of finance out there. And you need to build sometimes the capacity. You need some concessional finance for that. But it's these kind of concrete measures that can really help to get this process going. But of course, we need to use concessional finance. This is an area where we even in middle income countries, we're going to need concessional finance because the urgency is there and the justification. This is a global public good. We need to get this process going. We need to use those resources.
Thank you, Eric. Really interesting. We're going to go through some of the tools and mechanisms of what we can deploy. I saw a hand up right at the back. Can we get a microphone to the gentleman at the back there? Thank you. So please introduce yourself. And if we could keep it short, because we are starting to run out of a bit of time.
Thank you very much. My name is Edmond Balagbobo. I work with the African Export-Import Bank. I just wanted to lend my views to one of the comments that was raised around the need for the development of market framework to support Africa as far as carbon credit is concerned. in as much as carbon credit as an instrument achieves two objectives. One, it's going to be a source of revenue for African countries. And secondly, it's a tool to address climate change. In the context of COP, I think Africa needs to come up with a position to develop the relevant framework. That should be a focal point as far as the finance day for the climate change conference is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. Okay. If we could all take that comment and just expand on it and also add your closing comments to that. Oluranti, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Eleni. So just as my colleague mentioned on, carbon credits and carbon markets being one of the key issues that we should really push at the COP27. We've been in collaborations with some partner organizations on the continent, like UNECA, and we already have started working on some concepts around putting together a framework for carbon markets and carbon credits for the continent. And it is our expectation that working with the ministry, Minister Renia, under your sponsorship, we can, sort of launch this framework at the COP27 because we think it's key. You talked of DRC, having a lot of opportunities to trade carbon that they are able to, generate or, but we've also seen opportunities or requests come from other member countries. For instance, we got a request from Senegal, and they were in a state of how do we move? We have this opportunity. We think we have opportunities to trade carbon credits. We have opportunities to be able to use that to attract financing into our country. But there seems to be no framework. So it is a key thing that we want to focus on as African MDBs to be able to put together this framework and to launch it at the COP. Thank you.
Thank you. James.
Yes, just to continue, if Africa needs to develop those carbon markets, we need perhaps 3 levels of action. The first level, of course, is the level of overall framework. The second level is market supervision and regulation to avoid problems. And I understand that the Egypt Monetary Supervisory Authority is now lining up with the African regulatory authorities working together for the market rules and regulations. And as UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, that we are very supportive of this and will provide technical support together with them. And the third level is really the stock exchanges of the African countries, and then to make sure the market is enlarged and it can be traded on all the markets rather than just individual countries. So that would be a segmented approach. But first and foremost, I think the Minister and the Exim Banks working on overall framework is very important. Strategy goes first and then complement and then concretized by market regulations and market itself.
Dr. Khalida.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to come back to the theme of the COP, from pledges to implementation. So let's not forget that. We need to use all the tools that we have, including many of those that we discussed today. We heard the carbon market now, but equity must also be at the heart of what we are discussing, and the Africa COP must deliver on that. If I may conclude with a personal comment, I'm African, I'm Algerian, and it hurts me sometimes to see that we are not exchanging enough. Capacity exists within Africa, not in all countries. So my call to you, Dr. Rania, sorry, I'm calling on you and adding some burden, is to launch something on South cooperation. And I think we can launch something that could be called Africa with Africa for Africa. I think it's very important. The last point we heard about carbon market, I want to mention the job market. Because government to embark on that in any country, they need also incentive to ensure they have impact on economic growth. And if you look at the job creation, we know by now that the green market can create 3 times more jobs than the fossil fuel sector. Thank you very much.
Brilliant point. Thank you so much. Dr. Rania, I'm going to end with you, so I'm just going to jump over if you don't mind. Mafalda?
what else to add here? I mean, on carbon markets, I think there's a lot of discussions going on in the context of the COP as well, rules to be put out. Um, I think, and people said, really there's a need for systems for regulatory frameworks in place. But it would also be good to assess, because Africa is such a low emitter globally. What is really, what is the revenue stream that we are really talking about that can come to the continent vis-a-vis the overall global market? And I'm not saying it's not an opportunity. It is an opportunity that I think needs to be tapped into. But I think, again, is one tool as part of a broad array of tools that one needs to look at. So this is on carbon markets. I really think that this COP needs to be about renewing solidarity. It needs to be about a renewed solidarity framework because we desperately need it in this context of required climate ambition, and with all of the difficulties that countries are experiencing because of COVID and the war in Ukraine. So that is what I think it's the big task. I think Egypt has an extraordinary work, which is, as Minister said, let's work on reforming systems, but let's work on practical platforms and projects in country and get people to actually look at them and fund them so that we move forward.
Fantastic. Eric.
Yeah, we need all the instruments. We need the carbon markets, we need the offset markets, we need a lot of standardization to get this going. I think they would be a very nice complement to what the initiative that I mentioned that was launched yesterday to allow these kind of bonds that would be linked to performance on climate and nature that could allow emerging and developing countries to reduce their debt burdens by implementing some of the things we want them to do, and could be an opportunity to recognize the contribution that Egypt does in terms of cleaning the Nile and so on. So I think these are very much related instruments. We need to use them all, and this is, without them, we won't be able to succeed in the net zero transition.
Thank you. Dr. Rania, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, well, just on the carbon market, I think pricing is important. So, exploring that in more detail, and that's where the technical assistance, where the framework, where the regulation, and we need to work on that fast. There's an opportunity now, at least for us in Egypt with Nawafi, we want to start looking at that in more detail and see how we can benefit. On the South-South, we have the South-South Academy with UNDP, but I think after COP, it's going to be a very good opportunity to expedite the work. And now we have an agenda on with everything that's happening, more concrete. On a personal note, my knowledge of climate finance and climate action has become exponential since Glasgow. And it's very important because there were outcomes from Glasgow that brought the private sector into climate, that brought more in terms of what climate agenda is about. It's about stakeholders. Everyone has something to contribute. And with this notion of solidarity, with the notion of empathy towards what the people in the continent need, the people in different areas need, I think we can move forward. When we were designing and sending out the invitations for the ICF, we wanted to make sure that the climate finance landscape was properly reflected in the attendance and in the participation. So to have the GFAN's head here, to have Secretary Kerry here, to hear from the EU in the Nawafi roundtable, to have the representation from the international community and the MDBs and the regional banks, and to have a discussion, a frank discussion on the JETPs, the G7 initiative, and to provide an example, a nationally owned example which is Nuafi, we wanted to bring all of this together in one place 60 days before COP to basically say it is through international cooperation, it is through coordination that we can move forward. Nobody can do it by themselves. Everybody has something to contribute, and we're trying as much as possible to align the priorities, at least, despite having a system which needs to be fixed, what have you. But I'm very excited and very happy and very honored to have all of you with us at the Egypt ICF. I think it's been much, it exceeded our own expectations. And I think as we conclude today with the statement from the African ministers, with everybody here, I think we are ready for Finance Day at COP. And it doesn't end there. It actually pushes us forward. It catalyzes the agenda, but I think an agenda with identified tasks for each one of us. And this is what we try to bring to life in the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and for the seriousness in the discussion, for taking everything on board. And then we have now to work on everything that we decided by after 6 p.m. today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rani. I have to say, yes, round of applause. You've been so pioneering, actually, with this guidebook and WEFI and all the work that you have been doing on the ground. And I think it definitely shows that you can create systems that can be replicated across the continent to solve these big issues. And can I just say, and I think I need to remind the audience, I don't know if you've forgotten, that during the pandemic, we saw an incredible camaraderie between countries. Eventually, Africa was left behind, but the initial stages, there was global coordinated action. The private sector worked together to find a vaccine. Government institutions expedited things to try and get work done. And I hope that we can see the same push for the climate agenda on the continent, and we leave it to your hands because you are the people that are going to make sure that our children and our grandchildren have better lives. So thank you to all of you for your contributions and for the work that you do on the ground. Congratulations.
Thank you for the fantastic moderation.
Thank you.